In the 1970s and 1980s, Miami wasn't just a city known for its beaches and vibrant nightlife. It was a battleground where empires were built in the shadows. Streets that were once filled with the sounds of music and laughter began to echo with something darker, an underground world that few understood, but many feared. What started as a wave of small-time deals soon exploded into a larger, more complex system that shaped Miami's future for decades. The city became ground zero for a fierce power struggle, one that would leave an indelible mark on its history. Behind the palm trees and neon lights, a wave of intense activity surged. No one could have predicted the storm that was about to hit. With its proximity to Latin America, Miami became the perfect location for a secret world to rise, one that would pull in people from all walks of life, from eager entrepreneurs to powerful figures pulling the strings. The stakes were high and everything was on the line. What drove individuals to risk it all for the chance to become part of something much bigger than themselves? How did a city like Miami, known for its glamour, transform into the center of an unspoken conflict that changed the game forever? This is a deeper look into the Miami Narcotic War of the 70s and 80s, a time when money, power, and loyalty were at the heart of it all. Buckle up, because what we're about to explore isn't just history, it's the making of an era. In the 1970s, Miami was a city on the rise. Its tropical charm, vibrant nightlife, and proximity to the Caribbean made it a hot spot for both tourists and residents alike. But beneath the city's sun-soaked allure and glittering beaches, a darker world was quietly taking root, one that would change the course of Miami's history forever. It all started not with flashy deals in dark alleyways or gunfights, but with a series of quiet movements that would lead to Miami becoming the epicenter of the illicit substance trade in the United States. The first signs of what would become an all-consuming underworld in Miami can be traced back to the early 1970s. In this period, the city, like much of the U.S., was caught in the crossfire of a booming narcotic trade, largely stemming from the ongoing conflicts and political upheaval in Latin America, particularly in Colombia. What made Miami an ideal landing point for these illicit operations was its location, a perfect link between South America and the United States. The roots of Miami's narcotic trade began in the early years of the decade, with a wave of Cuban exiles arriving in Florida. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 had displaced many, and by the early 1970s, a new generation of Cuban immigrants began arriving, bringing with them a fresh set of connections and business acumen. Some of these new arrivals were not interested in a clean slate. They came to Miami with ties to the world of crime. Many were linked to the infamous Cuban Mafia. These figures slowly became involved in the underbelly of the narcotic trade, building a network that would soon connect Miami to the world of narcotics. But the real shift didn't occur until the mid-1970s, when Colombia's powerful cartels, particularly the Medellin and Cali cartels, began turning their attention toward Miami as a crucial part of their distribution network. The Colombian cartels, led by notorious figures like Pablo Escobar, saw Miami as an entry point into the lucrative American market, and they quickly began making their moves. Miami's geography played a pivotal role in making the city a central hub in this operation. The city's proximity to the Caribbean islands, combined with its easily accessible coastline, made it an ideal location for narcotic smuggling. Airplanes, boats, and even small fishing vessels were used to transport illicit substances from the Caribbean and Latin America. These narcotics would then be brought into Miami, where they were distributed across the United States. One of the first major waves of narcotic smuggling into Miami began in the early 1970s, when cartels used small aircraft to fly massive quantities of illicit substance from Colombia to South Florida. The illicit substance would then be stored in safe houses around Miami and transported to other parts of the country. These shipments were often hidden in seemingly innocent cargo, clothing, food containers, or even sports equipment. As the Colombian cartels expanded their operations, they recruited a number of local criminals in Miami, many of whom were already involved in petty crime. These recruits, known as mules or runners, helped the cartels transport their goods. Among them was a woman who would later go down in history as one of the most infamous figures in Miami's narcotic trade, Griselda Blanco, also known as the narcotic godmother. Blanco's rise to power in the 1970s and early 1980s is often seen as the turning point in Miami's involvement in the narcotic trade. Blanco, who had immigrated to the U.S. from Colombia, quickly became one of the most powerful narcotic lords in Miami, and her operations brought enormous amounts of narcotic into the city. She was known for her ruthlessness and for organizing some of the most innovative and deadly narcotic smuggling tactics. Blanco's operation made use of a network of planes, boats, and underground tunnels to move illicit substance into the U.S., and she quickly amassed a fortune as a result. Her reign would not last long, though. As the 1980s progressed, law enforcement began catching on to the operation, and the FBI launched a series of investigations into the growing narcotic trade in Miami. This would lead to a massive shift in the city's narcotic landscape. Blanco's reign would eventually be brought down by the very law enforcement agencies that had begun to infiltrate the narcotic world. By the early 1980s, Miami was in the midst of an explosive growth in the narcotic trade. While Blanco was being pursued by law enforcement, another figure was rising in the world of Miami's narcotics scene, George Jung, known as Boston George. Jung, who had connections to the Medellin cartel, played a pivotal role in importing massive amounts of narcotics into Miami. It was under Jung's direction that the flow of narcotics into the United States exploded during the 1980s. Jung became one of the most well-known narcotic smugglers in history, working with the Medellin cartel to bring multi-ton shipments of narcotics from Colombia into Miami. Jung's story, as depicted in popular films like Blow, tells of a man who started out as a small-time smuggler, but who quickly climbed the ranks to become one of the largest narcotic dealers in the world. His operations stretched from Miami to California, with connections to major figures in the Colombian cartels. But, like many before him, his empire would eventually fall. In the mid-1980s, law enforcement caught wind of his operation and arrested him, sentencing him to prison. However, by the time Jung was captured, Miami had already become deeply entrenched in the narcotic business. The sheer scale of the trade was staggering, with hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into the city from the sale of illicit substances. The city itself had become a battleground, with rival narcotic factions fighting for control over the lucrative narcotic routes and markets. Miami's neighborhoods were rife with the violence and chaos brought on by the increasing demand for narcotic. Areas like Little Havana and Opa-locka became infamous for the bloody turf wars between rival gangs and cartels. The violence reached its peak in the late 1980s as rival cartels, each seeking dominance over the narcotic trade, launched violent attacks against each other. The government responded to the growing crisis with the War on Narcotics, led by President Ronald Reagan. The U.S. government launched several anti-narcotic operations, including the famous Operation Cobra, which led to the dismantling of multiple narcotic organizations in Miami. But even as law enforcement cracked down on the operations, Miami's role in the narcotic trade did not fade. The city's connection to Latin American cartels continued, even though it had transitioned from an initial focus on marijuana and narcotic smuggling to trafficking other narcotics. Miami remained a critical player in the international narcotic trade, but the fight to control its streets continued as long as demand for narcotics existed. By the late 1990s, the once flourishing narcotic trade had started to dwindle, with many of the cartels being brought to their knees by law enforcement and internal strife. Miami, however, was forever altered. It had gone from a sunny paradise to the epicenter of one of the most significant drug wars in U.S. history. Miami 70s and 80s, narcotic kingpins, First is Griselda Blanco. Griselda Blanco, born on February 15, 1943, in either Santa Marta or Cartagena, Colombia, became one of the most infamous figures in the world of illegal substance trafficking in the 1970s and 1980s. Known as the Black Widow for her ruthless tactics, Blanco's influence in the Miami narcotic market helped shape the violent and dangerous landscape of the narcotic cowboy era. Her rise from a poverty-stricken childhood to a powerful figure in the underworld is a tale of cunning, ambition, and ruthless determination. Blanco's early life set the stage for the dangerous path she would follow. Growing up in Colombia, Blanco was exposed to crime at a young age. By the time she was 11, she was already involved in a tragic incident where she allegedly helped kidnap and later shoot a child whose wealthy family refused to pay the ransom. This event marked the beginning of Blanco's dark journey, which saw her become a pickpocket, prostitute, and later the mastermind behind a vast narcotic trafficking empire. Her first marriage to Carlos Trujillo was short-lived, but it set the foundation for her eventual involvement in the narcotic business. After the divorce, Blanco reportedly had her ex-husband executed. In the early 1970s, Blanco's life took a turn when she met Alberto Bravo, a narcotic trafficker who introduced her to the world of illicit substance smuggling. The two set up a network to import the substance into the United States, operating out of New York City. Blanco's creativity and ambition knew no bounds. She would design lingerie with hidden compartments to smuggle narcotics, a tactic that was ahead of its time. However, in 1975, facing federal charges, Blanco fled to Colombia. She eventually suspected Bravo of stealing from her, which led to a fatal confrontation, and Blanco was once again left to lead the operation alone. By the late 1970s, Blanco had relocated to Miami, a city that would become synonymous with her name. In Miami, Blanco built a massive narcotic empire, bringing in millions of dollars every month through the distribution of illicit substances. She was involved in smuggling more than 3 tons of the substance annually into the United States, earning an estimated $80 million per month. Her violent approach to business was evident as she began eliminating competitors and rivals. Blanco's reign was marked by terror as she used hitmen, including motorcycle gunmen, to carry out her orders. One of the most notorious incidents was a shooting at Dadeland Mall in 1979, which was seen as a symbol of the bloody narcotic cowboy wars. Blanco was ruthless, and her willingness to use violence to maintain control made her a feared figure in the criminal world. Blanco's operations were not limited to Miami. Her reach extended to other major cities like New York and California. Her power came not only from her narcotic empire, but also from her ability to manipulate people and control her subordinates. Blanco's brutality was legendary, and she was reportedly involved in over 200 executions of lives. Her criminal activities continued to escalate until law enforcement agencies finally took notice. In 1984, Blanco was targeted by authorities, and she fled to California. But the following year, Blanco was arrested in New York on narcotic-related charges. In 1985, she was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While incarcerated, Blanco's criminal reach did not end. She continued to control her narcotic operation from behind bars, and she was even implicated in multiple executions. In 1994, after one of her trusted hitmen, Jorge Ayala, agreed to testify against her, Blanco was charged with several manslaughters, including one involving the demise of a 2-year-old child. Despite these charges, Blanco managed to avoid the death penalty, and in 1998 she pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter, receiving a reduced sentence. She was released from prison in 2004 due to health concerns and was deported back to Colombia. In Colombia, Blanco attempted to live a quieter life, but the violent reputation she had built in Miami never truly left her. On September 3, 2012, Blanco was assassinated in Medellin, Colombia. She was shot by a gunman on a motorcycle, a method she had used during her reign of terror in Miami. Second is Augusto Guillermo Willie Falcon. Augusto Guillermo Willie Falcon, born on September 1, 1955, became one of the most notorious figures in the history of narcotic trafficking in South Florida during the 1970s and 1980s. Together with his childhood friend, Salvador Magluta, Falcon built a powerful narcotic empire that smuggled thousands of tons of illicit substance into the United States. They were known as Los Muchachos, or the Boys, a name that reflected their rise from humble beginnings to becoming central figures in the world of illegal trade. Falcon's journey began when he and his family fled Cuba in 1967, settling in Miami. He quickly adapted to the new environment, and in the 1970s, he saw an opportunity to profit from the burgeoning narcotic trade. By 1976, Falcon was already involved in narcotic trafficking. His first significant deal in the narcotic trade with a partner netted him a profit of $700,000. But Falcon's real success came when he teamed up with Magluta. Together, they created one of the most significant narcotic trafficking organizations of their time. Their criminal operation grew exponentially. By the late 1970s, Falcon and Magluta were involved in smuggling massive quantities of narcotics, earning millions. Their business was not only lucrative, but also highly efficient. Falcon's group even used speedboats and private planes to transport narcotics across borders. In fact, by 1983, Falcon was reportedly making $100 million annually from his narcotic dealings. His empire's influence stretched far beyond Miami, reaching major cities across the U.S. and even connecting with powerful figures in Colombia, including the infamous Pablo Escobar. Despite his success, Falcon's operations were far from peaceful. His world was one of constant danger and corruption. The Miami narcotic trade during this time was a high-stakes environment, with criminal organizations battling for dominance. The rise of the Boys coincided with the growing violence and chaos of the war on narcotics, launched by the U.S. government in the 1980s. However, Falcon's organization was known for avoiding excessive violence, preferring bribery and corruption to maintain control over their territory. In January 1981, Falcon's mother was forcefully abducted as part of a ransom demand, a stark reminder of the dangers involved in his business. While his mother was unharmed, the incident sent a strong message about the risks of the trade. Falcon's involvement in violent events did not go unnoticed, and his growing empire led to multiple investigations by law enforcement. The moment of reckoning came in 1991. After years of investigation, federal authorities finally caught up with Falcon. A 25-man team from the U.S. Marshals Service raided his properties, uncovering millions of dollars in cash, gold, unlicensed firearms, fake identities, and detailed records of their illicit transactions. Despite the extensive evidence, Falcon was acquitted in 1996 due to jury tampering. An investigation later revealed that the jury had been bribed. However, this legal victory did not last. In 2002, after further investigations, Falcon pleaded guilty to money laundering, agreeing to a 20-year sentence. Falcon's story did not end in prison. After serving several years, he was released in 2017, only to be deported to the Dominican Republic in 2018. The move was influenced by the fact that Falcon had donated money to anti-Castro organizations, making it unsafe for him to return to Cuba. However, Falcon's life in the Dominican Republic was short-lived. Authorities there, uncomfortable with his presence, forced him to leave. His exact whereabouts remain unknown. Third is Fabio Ochoa. Fabio Ochoa Vasquez, born May 2, 1957, is a notorious figure in the history of the global narcotic trade, particularly known for his role as a leading member of the Medellin cartel. Along with his two brothers, Juan David and Jorge Luis, Ochoa became one of the most powerful and wealthy narcotic lords of the 1980s. The Ochoa family played a foundational role in establishing the Medellin cartel, which revolutionized the narcotic trade between Colombia and the United States. Their influence, particularly in Miami, was immense, cementing their place in both criminal history and global notoriety. The Ochoa brothers were raised in a wealthy family involved in cattle breeding and ranching in Medellin, Colombia. In the 1970s, as narcotic trafficking began to surge, Fabio Ochoa moved to Miami, Florida, where he quickly became involved in the distribution networks of the Medellin cartel. Miami was a crucial hub in the cartel's operations, with Ochoa running a major distribution center for narcotics being smuggled into the U.S. His connections in Miami allowed him to handle thousands of pounds of narcotics, making him one of the most influential players in the narcotic trade. The Medellin cartel, under the leadership of Pablo Escobar, controlled the flow of illicit substance into the U.S., supplying as much as 80% of the market. Fabio Ochoa's role within this operation was significant, and by 1987, he and his brothers had amassed such vast wealth that they were listed on the Forbes billionaire list. At the peak of their power, the Ochoas were considered to be at the helm of a billion-dollar narcotic empire. Fabio Ochoa's criminal activities were not limited to narcotic trafficking. The cartel's violent tactics, including bombings and assassinations, were central to its operations. One of the most infamous incidents associated with Ochoa and the Medellin cartel was the 1986 assassination of Barry Seal, an American pilot who had become an informant for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Seal's execution is believed to have been orchestrated by Ochoa, as the cartel sought to silence him for providing critical information to law enforcement. Ochoa's crimes also included money laundering, arms trafficking, and involvement in paramilitary activities. In the 1980s, as the cartel expanded its power, the Ochoa family helped form Colombia's first paramilitary group, Muerte a Secuestradores, Death to Kidnappers, in response to the forceful abduction of their sister. This group was responsible for the extrajudicial execution of suspected left-wing militants, contributing to the violent atmosphere that surrounded the Medellin cartel. Fabio Ochoa's downfall began in the early 1990s as the U.S. and Colombian authorities intensified their crackdown on narcotic lords. In 1991, under growing pressure from the U.S. government, Ochoa and his brothers surrendered to Colombian authorities, hoping to avoid extradition to the U.S. They agreed to serve prison sentences in Colombia as part of a deal that promised no future extradition. However, Ochoa's criminal career did not end there. In 1999, after his release from prison in Colombia, Ochoa resumed his illicit activities, continuing to coordinate narcotic shipments to the U.S. This led to his rearrest and subsequent extradition to the U.S. in 2001, where he was tried for his role in a large-scale narcotic smuggling conspiracy. In 2003, Ochoa was convicted of narcotic trafficking, conspiracy, and distribution charges, and was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Ochoa served 25 years of his sentence before being released from U.S. federal custody in December 2024. His release was part of a broader effort to clear out elderly inmates from the U.S. prison system, and he was deported back to Colombia shortly thereafter, arriving in Bogotá on December 23, 2024. Ochoa's return to Colombia marked the end of his prison sentence and the beginning of a new chapter for him. Upon arrival in Bogotá, Ochoa was met by immigration officials who confirmed that he was not wanted by Colombian authorities and was allowed to join his family. Despite his infamous past, no police action was taken against him at the airport. Ochoa's deportation ended a long period of imprisonment. As of now, Fabio Ochoa is a free man in Colombia, where he has returned to live with his family. Fourth is Adler Berryman Barry Seal. Adler Berryman Barry Seal was born on July 16, 1939, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. From a young age, Seal had an innate talent for flying. He became a licensed pilot before he was even out of his teens. His passion for aviation led him to a career as a commercial airline pilot, working for Trans World Airlines TWA in the early 1960s. However, his career path soon took a dark turn. In the early 1970s, Seal's life took a sharp deviation after he was involved in a plot to smuggle explosives, a scheme that led to his firing from TWA. Despite facing serious charges, the case was dismissed, but Seal's reputation was already tarnished. By the late 1970s, he shifted gears entirely and began smuggling substances into the United States. Initially dealing in marijuana, Seal's operations would expand into much more lucrative activities in the coming years, leading him into the dangerous world of narcotic trafficking. In the 1980s, Seal began working for the notorious Medellin cartel. His operation involved flying planes to Colombia, loading them with illicit substances and transporting them back to the U.S. He was responsible for transporting massive quantities of narcotic, sometimes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars per flight. His method was to use small planes to fly under the radar, literally, and drop his illicit cargo in remote locations, often in the swamps of Louisiana, before it was transported to various distributors. Seal's smuggling operations caught the attention of law enforcement by 1981, and by 1983, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration began investigating his activities. In 1984, after facing serious charges related to his smuggling activities, Seal made a deal with the DEA. He would cooperate with authorities as an informant in exchange for leniency in his own case. Seal's role as an informant led to a number of high-profile arrests, including cartel members and individuals involved in other illicit activities. He provided crucial information about the inner workings of the Medellin cartel, using his contacts within the narcotic world to set up stings and collect intelligence that would eventually lead to major arrests and convictions. Despite his cooperation with the DEA, Barry Seal's dangerous connections with the cartel made him a target. Seal's decision to work as an informant was a double-edged sword. While he assisted in taking down criminal networks, he also became a marked man. The Medellin cartel discovered his role as an informant and issued a deadly contract against him. In early 1986, shortly after Seal had completed his role as an informant, the cartel's hitmen carried out their mission. On February 19, 1986, Seal's life came to a violent end. He was approached by an individual while entering a Salvation Army center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The individual, armed with a suppressed weapon, approached Seal and fired several rounds. The shooting was a swift and fatal attack. Seal's ties to the cartel had come to a tragic end, and the world lost a man who had once been at the heart of one of the most dangerous and expansive narcotic operations in history. Fifth is Salvador "Sal" Magluta. Salvador "Sal" Magluta, born on November 5, 1954, in Cuba, was a Cuban-American narcotic kingpin and one of the most notorious figures in the history of the Miami narcotic trade. Along with his partner, Willie Falcon, Magluta ran a massive narcotic trafficking organization in the 1970s and 1980s, operating in South Florida. Together, they formed a powerful empire known as Los Muchachos, the Boys, which is remembered for importing tons of cocaine from Colombia into the United States, generating an estimated $2 billion in profits. Magluta was born into a Cuban family who owned a bakery in Little Havana, Miami. He dropped out of Miami Senior High School, and along with Falcon, he began dealing marijuana as a small-time operation. Their initial foray into narcotic quickly escalated when they met Jorge Valdez, an accountant-turned-narcotic smuggler with ties to the Medellin cartel. In 1978, they agreed to smuggle 30 kilos of narcotic for Valdez, making $1.3 million in the process. This marked the beginning of their narcotic empire, which would dominate the Miami narcotic scene for over a decade. Throughout the 1980s, Magluta and Falcon smuggled at least 75 tons of narcotic into the U.S., becoming one of the largest narcotic trafficking operations on the East Coast. Their network stretched from Colombia to various U.S. cities, including Miami, New York, and Washington, D.C. The duo's operation involved a network of boat drivers, pilots, suppliers, and money launderers, and they maintained close relations with major cartels like Medellin, though they reportedly kept a low profile in comparison to other violent narcotic lords. Magluta and Falcon were known for their charisma and generosity, often donating large sums to local charities and schools in Miami. Their nonviolent approach earned them a certain degree of respect, with many in their community viewing them as Robin Hood figures. They also participated in powerboat racing and enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, further cementing their status as local celebrities. Despite their public image, Magluta and Falcon's criminal activities were far-reaching and dangerous. By the late 1980s, the United States government had launched an aggressive effort to dismantle the narcotic trade in Miami. In 1991, the authorities indicted Magluta and Falcon on 17 charges related to narcotic trafficking, including operating a continuing criminal enterprise. At the time, they were accused of smuggling over 75 tons of narcotic into the U.S. from Colombia. The trial that followed was tumultuous. Magluta and Falcon were acquitted in 1996 after a lengthy legal battle, despite overwhelming evidence. However, it soon emerged that 3 witnesses set to testify against them were either attacked or executed, and several jurors were bribed to acquit them. These revelations led to a renewed investigation into the pair. After their acquittal, a series of investigations revealed bribery and corruption on a massive scale. In 1999, Magluta and Falcon were charged with bribing jurors and witnesses, as well as involvement in the manslaughter of 3 witnesses. The charges were serious, and they led to a retrial in 2002, which included accusations of money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. During this second trial, Falcon pleaded guilty to money laundering and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, serving only 14 years before his release in 2017. Magluta, however, refused to take a plea deal and was convicted on multiple counts, including bribery and money laundering. Although he was never convicted of ordering the manslaughter, he was sentenced to 205 years in prison, later reduced to 195 years following an appeal. Magluta's sentence has kept him behind bars for life. He is currently incarcerated at ADX Florence, a supermax federal prison in Colorado, known for housing the most dangerous criminals in the U.S. Magluta has faced serious health issues, including chronic kidney disease and mental health problems, which led his lawyers to petition for compassionate release in 2020. However, his request was denied in 2021, with the court ruling that he remains a danger to the community. Magluta's story has been immortalized in popular culture, particularly in the 2021 Netflix documentary Cocaine Cowboys: The Kings of Miami, which explores the rise and fall of his and Falcon's narcotic empire. As of now, Sal Magluta remains in prison with no chance of parole until the year 2166, and it is highly likely that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Miami became the epicenter of a violent struggle, largely orchestrated by various narcotic trafficking organizations, most notably the Medellin cartel. This conflict, often referred to as the Miami Narcotic War, saw ruthless battles fought on the streets and in the skies as narcotics flowed into the United States and the city transformed into the world's primary narcotic trafficking hub. Behind the chaos was a powerful underground economy built on the smuggling of illicit substances, which fueled a deadly game of power, greed, and control. The rise of Miami as a central point for narcotic trade began in the mid-1970s as the Medellin cartel, under the leadership of the infamous Pablo Escobar, saw an opportunity to dominate the narcotic market in the United States. At that time, Miami's geographical location made it an ideal point for the cartel to funnel vast quantities of narcotics from Colombia into the country. By 1975, Escobar's organization was already moving between 40 to 60 kilograms of narcotics to Miami every week. This operation would later expand to 70% of the narcotics supply in the United States, with the city becoming the primary transit point for this illicit substance. As the narcotic trade boomed, so did the violence. Miami quickly earned a reputation as the narcotic capital of the world. Rival traffickers, gangs, and the police were caught in a brutal struggle for control. One of the first significant incidents marking the beginning of the violent conflict was the 1979 shootout at Dadeland Mall. In broad daylight, two members of a Colombian gang shot and seriously injured several individuals over a turf dispute. The event sent shockwaves throughout the city and served as a stark reminder of the stakes involved in the narcotic trade. Soon after, the media would dub these individuals the Cocaine Cowboys, a nickname that would come to symbolize the wild and lawless era of Miami's narcotic wars. By 1980, the situation had escalated even further. Manslaughter became a daily occurrence, with 349 manslaughter reported that year. In the following year, that number climbed to 573, and the next year, Miami saw 621 demises. The city's morgue, overwhelmed by the body count, was forced to rent refrigerated trucks to store the growing number of bodies until they could be processed. The escalating violence became a part of the city's identity, with each man's slaughtering fueling more fear and suspicion as rival cartels vied for supremacy. The Medellin cartel's chief enforcers were figures like Griselda Blanco, a Colombian-born narcotic queenpin whose ruthlessness was feared throughout South Florida. Blanco was responsible for much of the violence during the early 1980s, with a body count suspected to be in the hundreds. She had built a multi-billion-dollar empire by masterminding large-scale cocaine operations, often ordering her enforcers to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to her business. Her reign was marked by public executions and a constant wave of brutal retribution against rival traffickers. Blanco's associates, including notorious figures such as Jorge Rivi Ayala, were similarly violent. Ayala, a hitman for Blanco, was convicted of 3 manslaughter, but is believed to have been involved in many more. The narcotic trade not only led to a rise in turf wars, but also a deeply ingrained culture of fear and intimidation in Miami. The public nature of the violence left citizens and law enforcement feeling powerless. In response to the escalating violence, law enforcement agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, and local police, were forced into action. In 1980, the DEA launched Operation Swordfish, a large-scale investigation into the narcotic operations operating out of Miami. However, the sheer volume of narcotic being smuggled into the city and the cunning methods employed by the traffickers made it difficult to slow the flow of illicit substances. Despite significant efforts, including the interception of large narcotic shipments and the arrest of key individuals, the cartels always found new ways to continue their operations. The government's response, while aggressive, had its limitations. President Ronald Reagan in 1982 declared the narcotic crisis a national emergency, setting up a task force in South Florida to combat the smuggling. Despite the increased manpower, the cartels maintained their dominance in the region. Even as the government ramped up its efforts to disrupt the trade, Miami's position as a cocaine hub continued to grow. One of the most infamous cases of corruption during this period was the Miami River Cop scandal, which revealed that 19 Miami police officers were involved in narcotic trafficking, theft, and bribery. They had been stealing large amounts of narcotic and cash from criminal organizations and keeping it for themselves or reselling it. The officers' involvement in the narcotic trade exposed the extent of corruption within law enforcement and further complicated efforts to curb the violence in the city. As the violence raged on, the economic landscape of Miami was forever altered. The influx of money from narcotic trafficking bolstered the local economy, especially in the banking sector, where millions of dollars in narcotic profits were funneled into accounts, many of which were untraceable. The banking industry in Miami was overwhelmed with large deposits, often made by smurfs, low-level couriers who would deposit large sums of cash in multiple banks to avoid triggering financial regulations. The money flowed freely, and banks were often accused of turning a blind eye to the source of the funds. By the mid-1980s, the violence had reached such a critical point that the city's infrastructure began to crack under the strain. The port of Miami became a prime point of entry for the narcotic trade, and smuggling operations were more elaborate and sophisticated than ever before. While law enforcement tried to clamp down on the cartels, the smugglers adapted, developing new routes and methods for trafficking. The result was an environment where the narcotic trade was embedded in every part of Miami's economy and society. In 1985, a turning point came with the interception of one of the largest narcotic shipments ever found in Miami. More than $9 billion worth of narcotic were seized. The government's growing commitment to shutting down the narcotic trade, combined with the increasing pressure from law enforcement, finally began to turn the tide. However, the cartel leaders, including Escobar, had already cemented their influence, and their ability to continue their operations for years to come remained intact. Despite the efforts of law enforcement and the government, Miami's narcotic war did not end overnight. It took until the late 1980s and early 1990s for the worst of the violence to subside, but the cartel's power was far from eradicated. The government continued its efforts to dismantle the cartels, targeting their financial operations and working to break up smuggling rings. By the early 1990s, however, the Colombian cartels, including the Medellin cartel, began to lose their grip on Miami as the Mexican cartels rose to prominence.